The air in the studio was thick, heavy with the scent of turpentine and drying oils, and something else, something far more primal. Dust motes danced in the slanted bars of late afternoon sun, illuminating the scene like a confessional. His fingers pressed into the soft flesh above her hips, desperate for an anchor in the swirling chaos they had created. "Sarah, please, we have to stop." Ethan's voice was a ragged whisper, torn between the raw pleasure coursing through him and the sharp, cold panic of consequence. "This is madness." Her head thrashed weakly against the canvas dropcloth spread beneath them, her hair, the color of honey in sunlight, fanning out like a fallen halo. A soft sound escaped her lips, a protest that died before it could fully form. "Number." "Not yet, Ethan," she pleaded, her voice breathy, her eyes squeezed shut as if to block out everything but the feeling of him, the impossible reality of their bodies moving together. "Oh God, please. Just a little longer." And just like that, the last whisper of resistance dissolved into a low, guttural moan, a sound of pure, unadulterated surrender that vibrated through them both, sealing their beautiful, terrible sin. But this fire, this all-consuming madness that felt both like salvation and ruin, didn't begin with a storm. It started with a quiet glance, just 6 weeks before, on a perfectly calm summer day. Ethan's life, until that moment, had been a portrait of suburban success, meticulously designed and executed, much like the houses he built for a living. His own home was a testament to this precision, a clean, architectural masterpiece with cool marble floors and windows that framed the manicured lawn like a lifeless painting. His wife, Clara, was the perfect complement to this life, elegant, organized, her love, a thing of quiet efficiency rather than messy passion. Their conversations had the comfortable rhythm of a business partnership. Their touches were brief, their nights were silent. He had everything a man was supposed to want, yet he existed in a state of quiet, numbing emptiness, the colors of his world slowly fading to gray. Then, one Tuesday in late July, the moving truck arrived next door, shattering the placid silence of the neighborhood. From the window of his sterile home office, he watched the chaos unfold, a vibrant, messy display of life that felt alien to him. And then he saw her. Amidst the boxes and the shouting movers, a woman with sunlight in her hair and a smudge of dirt on her cheek looked up, her eyes scanning the house next door, her new world. It was just a glance, a fleeting moment across a pristine white fence, but for Ethan, it was like seeing color for the very first time. The first few days, it was just noise, a background hum of disruption to the curated silence of Ethan's life. The groan of a heavy truck, the sharp rapport of a hammer, the indistinct shouts of movers echoing across the manicured lawns that separated the properties. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a chaotic element introduced into his perfectly balanced equation. From his office, a room of clean lines, dark wood, and the sterile scent of architectural paper, he would occasionally glance out, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he'd force his attention back to the blueprints spread across his desk. His world was one of precise angles and calculated spaces, and the raw, unscripted energy of new neighbors felt like a smudge on a clean drawing. His wife, Clara, had already cataloged them from a distance. "He's in finance, I think," she'd said over a cool, bloodless dinner of poached salmon and asparagus. "She doesn't seem to work, probably for the best. The garden is a complete disaster." Ethan had merely nodded, the information registering with the same emotional weight as a weather report. They were just new variables, soon to be absorbed into the quiet, predictable landscape of the neighborhood. But then came the moment that changed the texture of his world. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of late summer day in New England where the heat is no longer aggressive but lies soft and heavy, draping itself over everything like a golden blanket. A deadline loomed, a complex design for a public library that demanded his full attention, but his focus was fractured, his gaze drifting repeatedly to the window that overlooked the neighboring yard. And that's when he truly saw her for the first time. Not as a concept, not as the new neighbor, but as Sarah. She was kneeling in the overgrown patch of earth that Clara had so dismissively called a disaster, wrestling with a tangle of what looked like wild rose bushes. She was wearing a simple gray tank top, the fabric clinging lightly to her back, damp with the effort of her work, and a pair of faded denim shorts that were frayed at the edges. Her hair, a cascade of warm, honey-colored waves, was pulled back in a loose, messy knot, but rebellious strands had escaped, clinging to her temples and the nape of her neck. He watched, motionless, his pen hovering forgotten over the paper. He saw the graceful, economic way she moved, a remnant, perhaps, of some past life he couldn't imagine. There was a dancer's fluidity in the way she shifted her weight, a deliberate strength in the set of her shoulders as she pulled at a stubborn root. The sun filtered through the leaves of the old oak tree that straddled their properties, creating a shifting mosaic of light and shadow across her skin. One moment, her shoulder blade was a sharp, defined line in the shade. The next, it was bathed in a warm, buttery glow that made the tiny beads of perspiration there seem to shimmer. He found himself cataloging the details with the same intensity he applied to his work. The delicate curve of her spine as she bent forward, the faint, pale lines on her thighs, just below the hem of her shorts, where the sun hadn't reached, the focused set of her jaw, her lower lip caught between her teeth in concentration. She wasn't performing, she wasn't posing. She was simply existing, beautifully and completely absorbed in her task, and in that unself-conscious state, Ethan found her utterly captivating. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of Clara that very morning. She had been standing in their pristine white kitchen, dressed in a crisp linen sheath dress, ready for her charity committee meeting. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate. She had handed him his coffee, her fingers cool and dry as they brushed against his, and her smile had been a polite, perfectly executed gesture that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was beautiful, an undeniable fact. She was a finished piece, a polished statue he had placed in the gallery of his life. But Sarah was different. She was a work in progress, covered in smudges of dirt, her face flushed with effort, her body radiating a warmth he could feel even through the double-paned glass of his window. She was alive in a way that felt raw and vital and deeply, dangerously appealing. He felt a stir, a low, slow thrum in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It was the unwelcome, thrilling feeling of desire, not just for her body, but for the life she seemed to embody, a life that had texture and mess and genuine effort. She suddenly stopped, letting her arms fall to her sides and tilting her head back to the sky, closing her eyes against the Sunday. She took a deep, long breath, her chest rising and falling visibly under the thin gray cotton of her tank top. Her breasts, full and round, strained against the fabric, and Ethan felt his own breath catch in his throat. It was such an intimate, private moment, a moment of quiet communion with the afternoon, and he was a thief, stealing it from the safety of his perch. He felt a hot flush of shame, quickly followed by a cold spike of exhilaration. In that instant, she wasn't just a neighbor, she was a secret. His secret. He should have turned away, returned to the comforting certainty of his blueprints, to the world he could control. But he didn't. He couldn't. He stayed at the window, watching as she finally conquered the rebellious root, pulling it free from the earth with a small cry of triumph. He watched as she wiped a dirty hand across her brow, leaving a streak of soil on her forehead, and then smiled, a genuine, radiant smile directed at nothing and no one. And in his quiet, orderly office, Ethan felt the first, subtle crack appear in the foundation of his perfect life. The glance had become a gaze. The observation was becoming an obsession. And the fence between their worlds no longer felt like a barrier, but a threshold he was already, in his heart, beginning to cross. For a week, the window was enough. It was his private theater, a one-way mirror into a world that felt more vibrant than his own. He watched her wrestle the unruly garden into submission, saw her carry groceries from her car with a determined swing in her step, and once, caught a fleeting glimpse of her dancing in her living room to music only she could hear, a phantom of graceful movement behind sheer curtains. Each stolen image was a brushstroke, adding color and depth to the portrait of her he was painting in his mind. He learned the rhythm of her days, the way she took her coffee on the porch in the morning, the slight frown of concentration she wore when she was weeding. He felt a strange, protective intimacy, the kind a god might feel for a favored mortal. It was safe, it was contained, but it was not sustainable. The desire to hear the music, not just see the dance, became a low, persistent ache. The opportunity came on a Saturday morning so bright and clear, it felt like a command to be outside. He saw her from his kitchen, where he was going through the motions of making breakfast, the clink of his spoon against the ceramic bowl the only sound in the cavernous room. She was trying to coax a new climbing rose onto a trellis near the fence, her back to him. This was it. His heart gave a hard, single thump against his ribs, a drumbeat signaling the start of a performance. He left his uneaten breakfast on the counter, walked out the back door, and picked up a pair of garden shears with no real intention of using them. He began to snip randomly at a perfectly healthy boxwood hedge that bordered the fence line, the metallic snap of the blades sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet air. She didn't turn around. He moved closer, his steps deliberate on the soft grass. "Morning," he said, his voice sounding rusty, foreign. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you there." She startled slightly, turning to face him, a hand flying to her chest. "Oh, you scared me," she said, and then a slow smile spread across her face, transforming it. He had seen her smile from a distance, but up close, it was devastating. It reached her eyes, which he could now see were a complex mix of green and gold, like a forest floor in the autumn Sunday. "I'm trying," she laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "This rose has a mind of its own." He was now standing at the fence, the simple white barrier, the only thing separating them. He could smell the sweet, peppery scent of the roses, the rich aroma of damp earth, and underneath it all, a faint, clean scent that was uniquely her, like fresh linen and warm skin. "They can be stubborn," he said, his own words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He was supposed to be a man of design, of eloquent structure, but his mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by her proximity. All he could think about was the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the fullness of her lower lip, the way the morning sun caught in the fine, almost invisible hairs on her forearm. "You're Ethan, right?" she asked, resting her hip against the fence post. She was wearing an old, paint-splattered t-shirt from a university in Oregon and soft-looking yoga pants that clung to the curve of her hips and thighs. "I'm Sarah." He knew. He had known her name for days, had said it to himself in the quiet of his office. Hearing her say, it felt like an intimate confession. "I am," he replied, forcing a smile he hoped looked natural. "And this is Clara's pride and joy," he said, gesturing vaguely at the manicured garden on his side. "I'm just the manual labor." The joke was weak, but she laughed anyway, a real throaty laugh this time. "Well, your labor seems to be paying off more than mine." Their conversation drifted easily, starting with plants and soil types, then meandering to the neighborhood, the oppressive humidity, the relief of the coming autumn. The topics were mundane, the kind of script any two neighbors might follow, but the space between the words was electric. He found himself leaning against the fence, mirroring her posture. Their hands were inches apart on the top rail. He noticed her fingernails were short, practical, with little half-moons of dirt beneath them. He found this detail inexplicably arousing. He was used to Clara's perfect French manicure, her hands that were always soft, always clean, always careful not to touch anything that might mar their perfection. Sarah's hands looked like they created things, like they weren't afraid to get dirty. As they talked, his gaze kept returning to her mouth. He was fascinated by the way her lips moved, the way she would bite her bottom lip when she was thinking of a word. He imagined, with a jolt that was almost painful, what it would feel like to close the small distance between them and cover her mouth with his. These over-the-fence meetings became their ritual. They were never planned, not explicitly, but a new shared instinct seemed to guide them. If he saw her head out the back door, he would find a reason to inspect his sprinkler system. If she was reading on her patio, his lawn would suddenly need mowing in that exact quadrant. They talked about everything and nothing. He learned that she had given up a burgeoning career as a contemporary dancer to follow her husband, David, across the country for his job. She spoke of it without bitterness, but Ethan could hear the melancholy undertone, the faint ghost of a sacrificed dream. She learned that he had designed the striking new art museum downtown, and her eyes lit up with a genuine, intelligent interest that he rarely received from anyone, least of all his wife. Clara saw his work as a source of income and status. Sarah saw the art in it. She asked him about the lines, the use of light, the feeling he was trying to evoke. For the first time in years, He felt seen. He began to notice subtle changes in her. The paint-splattered t-shirts were sometimes replaced by soft, scoop-necked blouses. Her messy knot of hair would occasionally be a more deliberate, artful twist, a touch of color on her lips, a gloss that made them look wet and impossibly full. They were small signals, arrows shot over the fence, that he hoped were meant only for him. One afternoon, as they were laughing about a rogue squirrel that had been plaguing her bird feeder, her husband David appeared. He was a big man, handsome in a conventional way, with a booming voice and a handshake that felt like a contest. "Hey there, Ethan. Stealing my wife again?" He joked, slapping Ethan on the shoulder with a familiarity that felt entirely unearned. He wrapped an arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Honey, the Carlsons are on their way over. We should get the grill started." The easy intimacy, the casual ownership in the gesture, sent a hot, ugly spike of jealousy through Ethan. David barely glanced at him as he led Sarah away, his hand resting possessively on the curve of her hip. Sarah looked back over her shoulder just for a second, and in her eyes, Ethan saw a flicker of something apology, regret, before she turned away. He stood there for a long time after they had gone, his hand resting on the fence. It was still warm from where her hand had been. The quiet of his yard suddenly felt like a crushing silence, a profound and hollow loneliness. The line had been drawn, the difference between their worlds made painfully clear, but instead of retreating, he found the transgression more tempting than ever. He wanted to be on the other side of the fence. The annual neighborhood Labor Day barbecue was a command performance, a ritual of suburban belonging that Ethan usually endured with a kind of detached resignation. It was a sensory overload of forced cheerfulness, the sizzle and smoke of the grill, the high-pitched shrieks of children chasing each other through sprinklers, the drone of conversations about property taxes and school districts. He and Clara played their parts perfectly. He, the successful, affable architect, beer in hand, nodding at anecdotes he would instantly forget. She, the gracious, elegant wife, moving through the crowd with a practiced ease, her laughter light and perfectly timed. It was a familiar play on a familiar stage. But this year, a new actress had joined the cast, and Ethan found he couldn't take his eyes off her. Sarah was standing near the sprawling oak tree at the center of the lawn, a vision in a simple, sea-green sundress. The color made her hazel eyes seem greener, deeper. The fabric, a soft, light cotton, clung to her waist before flaring out, swirling around her knees with every slight breeze. Thin straps exposed her sun-kissed shoulders and the graceful, vulnerable curve of her neck. She looked like a displaced sea nymph, a creature of natural elegance, dropped into a world of polo shirts and khaki shorts. Her husband David had his arm draped around her, a gesture that looked less like affection and more like brand placement. "You met my wife, Sarah?" He boomed to another couple. "She's the artist in the family, spends all my hard-earned money on canvases and paint." He laughed, a loud, hearty sound, and the other couple joined in politely. Sarah offered a tight, small smile, her eyes briefly scanning the crowd, looking for an escape. Ethan felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. The casual cruelty of the remark, disguised as a joke, was a stone thrown into the placid waters of the party, and only he seemed to notice the ripples. He watched her for the next hour, a silent observer tracking her orbit. He saw the way David would interrupt her, steer her into conversations she had no interest in, then leave her stranded while he went to grab another beer. He contrasted it with Clara, who needed no steering. She navigated the social currents with the skill of a seasoned captain, her conversation effortless, her presence a cool, self-contained unit. At one point, she came over to him, placing a light, dry hand on his arm. "Darling, the Hendersons are asking about the lake house renovation. You should go say hello." Her touch was a signal, a piece of social choreography. There was no warmth in it, no intimacy. It was a prompt for his next line. He nodded, played his part, and moved away, the feeling of her hand already gone. Later, he found his chance. A lull in the social traffic, a moment of blessed quiet. He saw Sarah standing alone by the drinks table, slowly tracing the rim of her plastic cup, a pensive look on her face. The crowd had shifted to the other side of the yard to watch an impromptu game of cornhole. He felt that same pull he'd felt in his office, that invisible string drawing him toward her. He walked over, his own cup suddenly needing a refill. Escaping the riveting debate over crabgrass? He asked softly. She looked up, and the smile that bloomed on her face was genuine this time, a slow, warm sunrise that made his chest ache. "You have no idea," she said, her voice a low conspiracy. "I was about to feign a headache. I think I've reached my small talk quota for the month." He chuckled, pouring himself a drink he didn't want. "I know the feeling." An easy silence fell between them, comfortable, not awkward. It was as if they had stepped into a small bubble of quiet in the heart of the noise. "I heard what David said earlier," Ethan found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "About your painting." Sarah's smile faltered, and she looked down at her cup. "Oh, that's just David. He doesn't get it. It's not just a hobby, is it?" he pressed gently. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and what she saw there must have been enough. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not. It used to be everything." And then she began to talk. She told him about her years in a dance conservatory, the grueling discipline, the soaring moments of creation on stage. She spoke of painting as the thing that replaced it, the way to make her body feel alive without an audience. Her hands moved as she spoke, sketching shapes in the air, her face animated, alive with a passion he hadn't seen before. The tight, polite wife from the lawn was gone, replaced by this vibrant, compelling woman. He listened, completely rapt, not interrupting, just nodding, his eyes never leaving her face. He was so close now he could smell her perfume, a light, intoxicating scent of jasmine that seemed to cut through the heavy, smoky air of the barbecue. He noticed the way a single, thin strap of her dress had slipped slightly off her shoulder, exposing the smooth, sun-warmed skin beneath. He had a maddening, overwhelming urge to reach out and slide it back into place, to let his fingers graze that perfect, vulnerable curve. As she described a particular painting, her hand fluttered near his, and for a breathtaking second, their pinky fingers brushed against each other. The contact was feather-light, accidental, but it sent a shockwave straight through him. He saw her breath hitch, her words faltering for a moment before she recovered. They both knew it wasn't an accident. Not really. It was a question, asked and answered in a single, electric moment. "It's just nice," she finally said, her story winding down, her voice soft again. "To talk to someone who understands that it's not just about making something pretty, it's about needing to." "I think I understand," he said, his own voice huskier than usual. "I could listen to you talk about it all day." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken meaning. It was more than a compliment, it was a confession. "I see you. I want more of you." Her eyes widened slightly, her lips parting as if to say something, but the moment was shattered. "Sarah, honey, come meet the Wilsons." David's voice boomed from across the lawn, yanking them back to reality. The bubble burst. Sarah's expression shuddered, the artist retreating behind the wife's polite mask. "I should go," she murmured, not quite meeting his eyes. "It was nice talking to you, Ethan." She walked away, rejoining her husband, who immediately wrapped his arm around her again, staking his claim. Ethan stood by the drinks table, the cold plastic cup sweating in his hand, his skin still tingling where they had touched. He watched them for a moment, the handsome couple, smiling and laughing, playing their parts. The rest of the party passed in a blur. He spoke, he smiled, he ate, but he was a ghost, his real self still standing in that bubble of quiet with Sarah. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, it was time to leave. As he and Clara walked toward the gate, he saw Sarah and David a few yards away, also saying their goodbyes. For one final, charged moment, his eyes met Sarah's over the heads of the crowd. There was no smile, no wave. It was a look of pure, unvarnished communication. It held the intimacy of their conversation, the shock of their touch, and a terrifying, thrilling promise of what was to come. The emotional affair had been declared, not with words, but with a silent glance that was louder than all the party's noise. And they both knew, with a certainty that was as frightening as it was exciting, that the fence between their yards could no longer hold them back. The days that followed the barbecue were heavy and thick, with an unspoken tension, mirroring the oppressive late summer humidity that had settled over the region. The air was a warm, wet blanket, making every breath feel like a conscious effort. An uneasy stillness had fallen between Ethan and Sarah. The casual, over-the-fence conversation stopped. They still saw each other, of course, a brief, charged glance as she got the mail, a stilted, almost formal wave as he left for work, but the easy intimacy was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness that was both terrifying and exhilarating. They were circling each other, two planets knocked from their orbits, held in place by a gravitational pull they didn't dare acknowledge. The silent promise made in that final glance across the lawn had to be honored or broken, and neither of them seemed to know how to make the first move. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Then, the sky broke. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, the clouds gathering in bruised purple-gray masses on the horizon. The air grew still and unnaturally dark. Ethan was in his office, staring at a set of blueprints without seeing them, his thoughts entirely consumed by the woman next door, when the first fat drops of rain hit the glass like pebbles. Within minutes, the drizzle became a deluge. The wind rose to a howl, lashing the trees into a frenzy. It was a violent, cathartic storm, a physical manifestation of all the pent-up energy that had been building inside him. He stood at the window, not watching her this time, but watching the storm, feeling a strange kinship with its untamed fury. There was a sharp, explosive crack of thunder that seemed to shake the house to its foundations, followed by the sickening sound of splintering wood. The storm raged for an hour, and then, as quickly as it had come, it passed, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean, dripping, and strangely silent. The air smelled of ozone, wet asphalt, and the sweet green scent of wounded leaves. Ethan went to the back door and looked out. The devastation was immediate. A massive limb from the ancient oak tree in his yard had been torn away, and it lay sprawled across the back lawn like a fallen giant. And in its descent, it had crushed a 10-foot section of the pristine white fence that separated their properties. The barrier was gone, replaced by a chaotic tangle of leaves and splintered wood. As he stared at the wreckage, a symbol so obvious it was almost laughable, Sarah's back door slid open. She stepped out onto her patio, her hand flying to her mouth as she surveyed the damage. Her eyes, wide and startled, met his across the ruined boundary. In that moment, the awkwardness of the past few days vanished, replaced by a shared, immediate reality. There was no need for excuses or pretexts. "Stay there," he called out, his voice cutting through the dripping silence. "I'll come over. I think this one's my fault." He grabbed a pair of work gloves and a small handsaw, his mind strangely calm, his purpose clear. Clara was at her weekly yoga class, and he knew David was out of town on business until Friday. They were alone. The island of their two properties was, for this afternoon, entirely their own. He stepped through the jagged new opening in the fence, the act feeling momentous, a definitive crossing of a line he had only dreamed of. As he got closer, he saw that Sarah had changed into an old t-shirt and leggings, her hair pulled back. She looked practical, ready. "Are you okay?" he asked, his first concern for her, not the property. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little shaky. It sounded like the world was ending. They stood together for a moment, looking at the massive branch. It was too big to be moved in one piece. "I can cut some of the smaller limbs away," he said, taking charge. "But we'll have to move the main trunk together." They worked in a comfortable, efficient silence, the shared task a welcome distraction from the charged energy between them. He sawed away the smaller branches while she dragged them to a pile near the edge of the woods. He was intensely aware of her every movement, the way her leggings stretched taut over her thighs as she bent down, the damp t-shirt clinging to the small of her back, revealing the delicate knobs of her spine. The air was cool now, but he felt beads of sweat trickle down his temples. Once the smaller limbs were cleared, only the main section of the trunk remained, thick and heavy, pinning the broken fence panels to the ground. "Okay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ready?" She nodded, positioning herself on one side of the trunk while he took the other. "We'll lift on 3, just enough to drag it off the fence line." He counted, 1, 2, 3. They both squatted, their hands searching for a firm grip on the wet, rough bark. He found a hold, but as he looked across to check on her, he saw her smaller hands struggling to grasp the thick, slippery wood. "Here," he said, moving around to her side. Let's lift from the same side. It'll be easier. He knelt beside her, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. You take that spot there, he directed, pointing to a knot in the wood. I'll get a grip right next to you. She nodded, placing her hands on the bark. He reached down, his eyes on the trunk, and slid his own hands into place. And then it happened. His right hand, covered in a worn leather glove, was firm on the wood, but his left hand, bare and calloused, closed directly over her right. Time stopped. The dripping of the leaves, the distant hum of a lawnmower starting up, the cry of a blue jay, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. The only reality was the feeling of her hand beneath his. The bark was rough and abrasive against his palm, but the back of her hand was impossibly soft, warm, and alive. He could feel the fine, delicate bones, the subtle shift of her knuckles as his fingers curled instinctively around hers. It was not a brief electric brush like at the party. This was a sustained, undeniable connection, skin on skin, his large, strong hand completely encompassing hers. He felt a tremor go through her. Or maybe it was him, he couldn't be sure. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from their joined hands to her face. She was already looking at him, her lips slightly parted, her breath held. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the post-storm light, were full of a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. In them, he saw no resistance, no surprise, only a deep mirror image of the want that was clawing its way up his own throat. It was a silent, mutual confession. So it's you. It was always you. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, frozen in their tableau of imminent collapse, the heavy branch and the broken fence, the only witnesses. It could have been 5 seconds or 5 minutes. He only knew that in that moment, the world had been stripped down to this single, irrefutable point of contact. The internal war he had been fighting, the guilt, the duty, the desire was over. He had lost. Or won. He wasn't sure. Finally, with a reluctance that was a physical pain, he broke the gaze and slowly, deliberately, slid his hand away from hers. The air rushed back into his lungs. He felt her exhale, a soft, shaky sound. Okay, he said, his voice hoarse. On 3. They lifted the branch, their movements clumsy now, their bodies stiff and awkward. They dragged it into his yard and dropped it with a heavy thud. Neither of them spoke. The task was done, but the real work had just begun. Thank you, Ethan, she said finally, her voice quiet, not quite meeting his eyes. I should go in. He just nodded, unable to form words. He watched her turn and walk back toward her house, her steps seeming unsteady. She didn't look back. He stood there for a long time, staring at the gaping hole in the fence, a wound in the landscape of his life. He looked down at his left hand, the one that had covered hers. He could still feel the phantom warmth of her skin. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was the point of no return. The storm had passed, but the real wreckage was just beginning. The touch had broken the world. In the days that followed, the space between their 2 houses felt charged, humming with an invisible current. The polite fiction of being just neighbors was gone, burned away in that single searing moment of contact. Now, when their eyes met across the lawn, there were no more stilted waves or forced smiles. There was only a raw, silent acknowledgement, a shared secret that was both a bond and a burden. Ethan felt like he was living with a low-grade fever, his senses heightened, his thoughts constantly circling back to the feeling of her hand under his, the look in her eyes. The silence from her was not an absence of communication, but a different kind of conversation. It was the quiet of 2 people standing on a cliff's edge, both waiting for the other to jump, knowing they would follow. The universe, it seemed, had decided to push them. On Thursday, Ethan watched from his window as David loaded a suitcase into his car, gave Sarah a perfunctory kiss, and drove away. A business trip, Ethan guessed. Later that day, Clara announced she was driving up to her mother's for the weekend. "The house is yours, darling," she'd said, her tone suggesting it was a gift, though to Ethan it felt more like an abandonment to his own failing willpower. And just like that, the obstacles vanished. The spouses were gone. The children were with their respective grandparents. The neighborhood was slipping into the quiet rhythms of a late summer weekend. There were no more guards, no more fences, no more excuses. There was only the gaping hole in the boundary between their yards and the yawning, cavernous emptiness in his own life. Friday night was an agony of indecision. Ethan paced the cool, silent rooms of his house, the perfect order of which felt like a mockery. He poured a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, turned on a television he didn't watch. Every sound from outside the chirp of crickets, a car passing on the street made his head snap toward the window, toward her house, where a single warm, golden light shone from the living room. She was over there, alone, just as he was. Was she thinking of him? Was she feeling the same unbearable magnetic pull? The question was a torment. He knew he should stay put, ride out this temporary madness until their spouses returned and the comforting, suffocating structure of their lives was restored. But the memory of her touch, the promise in her eyes, was a far stronger force than his conscience. Finally, he couldn't bear it anymore. He manufactured the flimsiest of pretexts, a lie so transparent it was almost an insult. He needed to borrow a pipe wrench to tighten a fixture. It was a pathetic shield for his true intentions, but it was the only one he had. His walk across the damp lawn felt surreal, each step a conscious, deliberate betrayal. He passed through the broken fence, a Rubicon crossed, and approached the soft glow of her back patio door. He could see her silhouette inside, curled on the sofa, reading a book. He raised his hand and hesitated for a long, heart-pounding moment before knocking softly on the glass. She looked up, and for a second, he saw surprise in her eyes, quickly replaced by something else. Recognition, an unnerving lack of surprise. She slid the door open. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet. She wasn't asking a question. She was stating a fact. She was wearing a simple white tank top and a pair of soft, gray shorts. Her feet were bare, her hair was loose, and on her face was no makeup, only a look of profound, weary understanding. She knew. She had been waiting, too. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was fixing a leaky pipe under the sink and my wrench." He trailed off, the words absurd. She didn't respond to the excuse, simply stepped back. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and the door slid shut behind him, the sound sealing them in. He was in her world now. It smelled of her, that same mix of jasmine and something else, something warm and lived in, like coffee and old books. Canvases in various stages of completion were leaning against the walls, their colors vibrant and chaotic. A wine glass, half full, sat on the coffee table. It was a space that was unapologetically alive, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the curated museum he called home. They stood a few feet apart in the center of the room, the pretense of the wrench forgotten, the air thick with everything they had left unsaid for weeks. The only sound was the gentle patter of rain beginning to fall outside, a soft drumming that insulated them from the rest of the world. He didn't know how to start. What could he possibly say? "I've been obsessed with you since the day you moved in. Your husband is a fool for not seeing who you are. Touching your hand was the most real thing I've felt in a decade." All of it was true, and all of it was impossible. He saw a flicker of her own turmoil in her eyes, the way she worried her lower lip, the way her hands were clenched into loose fists at her sides. He had to do something. He had to end this unbearable silence. He took one step toward her, then another. He stopped when he was so close he could feel the warmth from her skin, so close he could see the faint, rapid pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He lifted his hand, his fingers trembling, almost imperceptibly, and very gently, he brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his knuckles grazing her skin. The touch was feather-light, but it was like a lit match to gasoline. "Sarah," he breathed, and her name was a prayer, a confession, a surrender. Her eyes, which had been wide and searching, fluttered shut. It was all the permission he needed. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The first moment was one of stunning, unbelievable softness. It was hesitant, tender, a question asked in a language beyond words. It was the taste of her, the reality of her, after weeks of fantasy. She made a small sound in the back of her throat, a soft, broken sigh, and her hands came up to grip his shirt. And then, the dam broke. The tentative question became a declarative statement. The tenderness was consumed by a sudden, ravenous hunger. All the stolen glances, the charged conversations, the near misses, and the repressed longing erupted in a kiss that was no longer gentle. It was deep and wet and desperate. It was a kiss of shared loneliness and mutual starvation. He tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her closer, his other hand finding the small of her back, pressing her body flush against his. She responded with equal fire, her mouth opening under his, her body arching into his embrace. It was a collision, a frantic, beautiful, catastrophic crash. They were not just kissing, they were trying to breathe each other in, to erase the weeks of separation, to consume the loneliness that had defined both their lives. When they finally broke apart, they were breathless, panting, their foreheads resting against each other. The rain was drumming harder now against the windows, a frantic heartbeat mirroring his own. The real world, with its rules and consequences, was out there, somewhere in the dark. But in here, in this small circle of warmth and stolen breath, a new world had just been created, and its first irrevocable law had just been written on their lips. The kiss ended, but the storm it had unleashed was just beginning. They stood in the center of her living room, foreheads pressed together, chests heaving as they dragged air into starved lungs. The world had shrunk to this small, charged space between them. Outside, the rain beat a steady rhythm against the windows, a primal drumbeat for the scene unfolding within. Ethan looked into her eyes, saw the fear and the confusion swirling there, but underneath it all, he saw the same wild, desperate hunger that was consuming him. There was no going back. The word wrong had been spoken by the thunder, and the word mistake had been written by the lightning, and neither of them cared. He didn't think. He simply acted, a creature of pure, undiluted impulse. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. His mouth claimed hers with a raw possessiveness, his hands sliding from her back to cup her face, his thumbs stroking the frantic pulse fluttering beneath her jaw. She met his hunger with her own, her fingers digging into the muscles of his shoulders, pulling him impossibly closer. It was a clumsy, frantic dance of pure need. He backed her up, their legs tangling, their mouths never breaking contact. They stumbled against the edge of the coffee table, a half-full wine glass tipping over, its dark red contents bleeding into the cream-colored rug like a beautiful, terrible wound. Neither of them noticed. He pushed her gently back until her spine met the cool plaster of the wall, trapping her there with the weight of his body, the intensity of his kiss. His hands were frantic, learning the lines of her body through the thin layers of her clothes. He broke the kiss to press his mouth to the column of her throat, tasting the salt and jasmine of her skin. She gasped, her head falling back against the wall, her throat arched in surrender. "Ethan," she breathed, a sound that was half plea, half prayer. His fingers found the hem of her simple white tank top, pulling it upward with trembling urgency. He needed to see her, to feel her. He pulled the fabric over her head in one swift, desperate motion, tossing it aside, and then he froze. She was even more beautiful than he had imagined in his countless feverish fantasies. She was wearing a delicate, intricate bra of black lace, a fragile piece of art that seemed both to conceal and to highlight the perfect, pale skin beneath. Her breasts were full, round, straining against the sheer fabric, their pale luminosity, a stark, breathtaking contrast to the darkness of the lace. Her skin was flushed, her nipples, hard little points pushing against their delicate cage. He stared, his breath catching in his throat, feeling like a common thief who had just broken into a sacred vault. His reverence lasted only a moment before the hunger returned, sharper than ever. As his hands came up to touch her, to unfasten the final barrier between them, a flicker of reality seemed to break through her haze. "Ethan, wait," she whispered, her voice trembling, her hands coming up to weakly push against his chest. "We shouldn't. Clara, David, this is so wrong." Her words were the right ones, the ones her conscience demanded she say, but her body was telling a different story. It was leaning into him, not away. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. He paused, his eyes locked on hers, seeing the war raging within her. He knew he should stop, be the better man, walk out the door and pretend this never happened. But the man who lived in the pristine house next door, the respectable architect, was gone. There was only this raw, wanting creature who had been starved for a decade. Instead of pulling back, he leaned in and pressed his open mouth to the soft swell of her breast, just above the scalloped edge of the lace. Her protest died in her throat, strangled by a sharp, involuntary gasp. Her hands, which had been pushing against his chest, went limp, then slid up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. The battle was over. The surrender was absolute. His own shirt came next, buttons torn free in his haste, and then they were tumbling down, a tangle of limbs and breathless whispers, onto the soft, forgiving expanse of the rug. Next to the still-spreading wine stain, the world dissolved into a blur of pure sensation. The slightly rough texture of the wool beneath her bare back, the heat of his skin against hers, the dizzying scent of her arousal mixed with the rain-washed air. In his desperate hurry, his thumb caught on the thin lace strap of her bra, and it tore with a soft, final rip. The sound was shockingly intimate, a small act of destruction that was more exciting than any seduction. And then she was free, her breasts spilling into his hands, pale and perfect and real. He worshipped her with his mouth, his hands, learning every curve, every hollow. Her quiet, hesitant gasps turned into low, guttural moans, the sound of pleasure so profound it was almost painful. She called out his name, over and over, the word breaking apart as waves of feeling crashed over her. He was lost, adrift in the scent and taste and feel of her, a man who had been wandering in a desert and had finally, blessedly, found water. There was no thought, no future, no past, only the frantic, driving rhythm of their bodies, a desperate, primal act of two lonely souls trying to find a moment of grace in a beautiful, shared sin. And in the final, shuddering moments, as they both fell over the edge into a blinding white oblivion, the only sound in the room was the sound of their ragged, desperate breathing, and the relentless, cleansing sound of the rain. The silence that fell after the storm of their bodies was a different kind of violence. It was a heavy, suffocating thing pressing down on them, amplifying the sound of their own ragged breathing and the steady, indifferent drumming of the rain outside. They lay tangled on the wine-stained rug, no longer two souls merging, but two separate, suddenly awkward bodies, slick with sweat and the undeniable evidence of their transgression. The heat of the moment had evaporated, leaving a cold, damp chill in its wake. Ethan was the first to move. He untangled himself from her limbs with a slowness that felt like pain, avoiding her eyes, unable to look at the woman he had just known so completely. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their absent spouses, with the colossal weight of their shared guilt. He found his discarded shirt, his hands clumsy as he fumbled with the buttons, some of which were missing, torn away in his earlier haste. "I should go," he said, the words a dull thud in the quiet room. Sarah didn't answer. She had pulled a throw blanket from the sofa, covering herself, creating a barrier. She was looking at the dark, spreading stain on the rug, her expression unreadable. He wanted to say something. "I'm sorry, thank you. What are we doing?" But all the words felt like lies. The only truth was the raw, undeniable act that now lay between them. Without another word, he walked to the sliding glass door, stepped out into the rain-washed night, and crossed the space between their homes. The gaping hole in the fence, feeling less like an opening and more like a fresh, open wound. He slipped back into his own house, a ghost returning to his own mausoleum. The silence here was different from the silence in her living room. Hers had been heavy with recent events. His was the deep, hollow silence of absence. The house was exactly as Clara had left it, pristine, orderly, a testament to a life he suddenly felt he had no right to inhabit. He stripped off his clothes by the back door, leaving them in a damp, guilty pile, and walked naked through the perfect, dark rooms to the master bathroom. Under the scalding spray of the shower, he scrubbed at his skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the scent of her jasmine perfume, the feel of her skin under his hands, the taste of her on his lips. But it was a futile effort. The memory wasn't on his skin. It was under it, a fever in his blood. He saw her face when he closed his eyes, heard her gasped breaths in the rush of the water. He leaned his forehead against the cold tile. A wave of self-loathing so profound it made him dizzy. He was a cliché, the bored suburban husband, the faithless betrayer. He thought of Clara, of her cool, predictable decency, of the vows he had made to her in a sun-drenched church a lifetime ago. The guilt was a physical thing, a shard of glass working its way into his heart. Across the lawn, Sarah was engaged in her own desperate ritual of erasure. After he left, she stayed on the floor for a long time, wrapped in the blanket, shivering despite the humidity. Then, with a frantic, mechanical energy, she began to clean. She stripped off her own clothes, bundling them with his abandoned shirt and shoving them deep into the bottom of a laundry hamper. She found stain remover and went to work on the rug, scrubbing at the dark red blotch with a fury, as if she could physically remove the memory of their act from the very fibers of the room. But the more she scrubbed, the more the memory seemed to mock her. Her body ached with a delicious soreness that was its own testament. Every muscle was a reminder. Her lips felt swollen, bruised. Just as she was finishing, her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a picture of David, smiling broadly on a golf course. Her heart seized. She answered, her voice a strained, false imitation of normal. "Hey, you," she said. He was loud, cheerful, oblivious. He talked about his meetings, about a bad call he'd made on the 7th hole, about the steak he'd had for dinner. "Everything okay there, babe? You sound tired." "Just a long day," she'd replied, the lie catching in her throat. "Missing you." After they hung up, she sank to the floor, the full, crushing weight of her deceit landing on her. She hadn't just betrayed her husband. She had betrayed the entire life she had built, and for what? A few hours of feeling alive. The next morning, the sun rose into a brilliantly clear sky, its cheerful light feeling like an accusation. They avoided each other with a grim, deliberate precision. When Ethan went to get his newspaper, he saw her through her kitchen window and quickly ducked back inside, his heart pounding. When she took out the trash, she kept her back to his house, her movements stiff and unnatural. The broken fence, once the stage for their burgeoning intimacy, was now a monument to their shame, a jagged line they did not dare to cross. The silence stretched through the day, a taut, vibrating wire. But with the guilt came something else, something insidious and powerful, the craving. For Ethan, it was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He tried to work, but the precise lines of his blueprints would blur into the memory of her curves. He'd be standing in his kitchen, and the scent of Clara's potted jasmine plant by the window would transport him back to the smell of Sarah's skin. He found himself touching his own lips, his own chest, trying to recall the exact sensation of her. The quiet emptiness of his life, which had once been a dull, manageable ache, was now an active, agonizing void. He had tasted water in the desert, and now the thirst was all-consuming. He hated himself for what he had done, but God, he wanted to do it again. For Sarah, the craving was a physical thing, a series of ambushes throughout the day. She would be folding laundry, the familiar, clean scent of David's clothes in her hands, and her body would betray her, a liquid warmth pooling in her belly as she remembered the raw, musky scent of Ethan's skin. She would walk through the living room, and her eyes would snag on the faintly damp patch on the rug, and a full-body memory would wash over her, the feel of the rough wool on her back, the weight of him on top of her, the sound of her own voice crying his name. It was a poison, and it was a nectar. She felt a thrill of secret power, a feeling of possessing a life that was entirely her own, separate from being a wife and a mother. But it was immediately followed by a wave of shame so deep it felt like drowning. She had crossed a line, and she was terrified to realize that a part of her, a wild and reckless part she didn't know existed, had no desire to go back. The day bled into evening, the sun set, and the lights in their respective houses flicked on, two islands of lonely light in the gathering dark. They were separate again, back in their cages. But something had fundamentally changed. The guilt was a heavy cloak, but the memory of the fire was a burning ember beneath it. They both knew, in the silent, solitary darkness of their own homes, that this was not the end. It was the beginning of the addiction, and an addict will always, eventually, seek another fix. 3 days, 72 hours of a suffocating, charged silence that was louder than any argument. Ethan existed in a fog of guilt and a burning, relentless craving. He tried to lose himself in his work, but the clean, rational lines of his blueprints felt like a foreign language. His mind, his body, only understood the chaotic, beautiful poetry of the hours he had spent in Sarah's arms. He would catch her scent on the breeze, and his stomach would clench. He would see a flash of her honey-colored hair as she moved past a window, and his heart would hammer against his ribs. He was an addict in the first, agonizing throes of withdrawal, and his drug was just on the other side of a broken fence. The guilt was a cold stone in his gut, but the hunger was a fire, and by Saturday afternoon the fire was winning. He knew David was due back the next evening. The window of opportunity, of solitude, was closing. He sat in his silent office, his phone heavy in his hand, his thumb hovering over her name. It was a choice. Not a mistake, not a moment of weakness, but a conscious, deliberate decision to set the world on fire just to feel warm again. His thumb tapped the screen. The message was brutally simple, a command, not a request. Your studio, 3 p.m. He hit send before he could lose his nerve, then tossed the phone onto his desk as if it were burning hot. The minutes that followed were the longest of his life. He stared at the blank screen, his pulse a frantic drum in his ears. He expected silence, a refusal, the digital equivalent of a slammed door. But then, the screen lit up, a single word. Okay. The relief was so profound, so absolute, it almost brought him to his knees. The guilt was still there, but now it had a partner, a wild, soaring exhilaration. The choice had been made. The sin had been sanctioned. Across the lawn, Sarah stared at her phone, her own heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. His text was not a surprise. It was an inevitability she had been dreading, and if she was honest with herself, desperately hoping for. The last 3 days had been a special kind of hell. She'd performed normalcy for her children, answered David's nightly calls with a hollow cheerfulness, all while her body hummed with the memory of Ethan's touch. She felt split in two, the dutiful wife and the wanton creature who had come alive on her living room floor. Ethan's message wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to that other self, the one she was beginning to realize was more real than the role she had been playing for years. Her okay was a surrender, but it was also a declaration. She was done fighting. She did not wait for him in her yoga pants and a paint-stained t-shirt. This time was different. This was not an accident. This was a decision. She went to her bedroom, to the back of her closet, and pulled out a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside was a slip dress of deep emerald silk, a thing of impossible softness that she had bought in a moment of optimistic vanity before her last move. Beneath that was a set of lingerie ivory lace, exquisitely made, impossibly expensive. A gift David had given her for an anniversary and then promptly forgotten about. It had never been worn. It felt like an artifact from another woman's life. Today, she would claim it as her own. She showered, letting the water wash away not the guilt, but the lingering hesitation. She put on the lingerie, the delicate lace cool and illicit against her skin. Then, she slipped the silk dress over her head, the fabric cascading over her curves like liquid jade. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, she recognized the woman staring back. It was the dancer, the artist, the woman who was desired. When Ethan stepped into her studio at precisely 3 o'clock, the world outside ceased to exist. This was her sanctuary, a place he had never been. The room was bathed in the hazy, ethereal light of a late summer afternoon filtering through a large, north-facing window. The air smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and her. Canvases in various states of creation were everywhere, a riot of color and emotion, and in the center of it all, she stood, waiting for him. The sight of her in the silk dress stole the air from his lungs. The fabric was so fine it seemed to float around her, clinging to the curve of her waist, hinting at the swell of her hip, the line of her thigh. It was a study in concealed and revealed beauty, and it was the most erotic thing he had ever seen. He didn't rush to her. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the quiet room, and simply looked at her, his eyes drinking her in. He walked toward her slowly, as if approaching a masterpiece in a gallery. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "you have no idea how much I've wanted this, how much I've thought about you." She gave him a small, trembling smile. "Tell me, Ethan," she whispered, her voice a low, husky invitation. "Tell me what you've been thinking." He was standing in front of her now, so close he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. He didn't answer with words. He reached out, not to grab her, but to reverently touch the silk of her dress at her shoulder. "I've been thinking about this," he murmured, his fingers tracing the line of the thin strap down to her collarbone. "And this." His hand slid down her arm, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her inner wrist. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this kiss was nothing like their first. There was no frantic, desperate hunger. This was a slow, deep, deliberate exploration, a savoring. He took his time, learning the shape and taste of her mouth as if committing it to memory. Her response was just as measured, her hands coming up to cradle his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. When they finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing heavily, but it was from the intensity of the moment, not a lack of air. His eyes, dark with desire, roamed down her body. "I want to see you," he said, his voice a raw command. With a slow, deliberate grace, she reached up and slipped the thin silk straps off her shoulders. The dress whispered down her body, pooling at her feet in a shimmering emerald puddle. And there she was. The ivory lace was a breathtaking work of art against her warm, flushed skin. He could see the hard peaks of her nipples through the sheer cups, the dark shadow of her curls beneath the delicate panel of lace at her hips. He let out a shaky breath. With a reverence that bordered on worship, he knelt before her. His hands went to her hips, his thumbs stroking the smooth skin just above the lace. He pressed his face against her belly, inhaling her scent, feeling the slight tremor that ran through her. He undressed her slowly, piece by piece, his hands and mouth exploring every inch of her as it was revealed. He learned the elegant curve of her waist, the soft, full weight of her breasts, the enticing, perfect roundness of her buttocks as he turned her in his arms. She was not a passive recipient of his adoration. Her hands were in his hair, on his back, her nails scraping lightly against his skin. Her moans were no longer surprised gasps, but low, confident sounds of pleasure, a running commentary of her own bliss. She guided his hands, whispered his name, told him what she wanted, with a beautiful, shameless honesty. They made love on a paint-splattered canvas dropcloth, surrounded by the vibrant, passionate evidence of her art. It was slow and deep, and it was a conversation. It was a deliberate, conscious act of creation, two lonely people building a temporary, beautiful world in the ruins of their own. Afterward, they lay in the dappled sunlight, their limbs tangled, the air thick with the smell of sex and paint. There was no awkward, guilty silence this time. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, and a dangerous, illicit peace settled over them. They had moved past the point of sin. This was now their reality. A secret, beautiful, and utterly devastating reality. The affair, once a cataclysmic event, a singular explosion that threatened to tear their worlds apart, soon settled into a quiet, dangerous rhythm. The raw shock of the first encounter and the deliberate passion of the second gave way to something far more insidious. A routine. Their secret was no longer a wild, untamed thing. It was a carefully cultivated garden, tended to in the shadows, its roots spreading silently and deeply beneath the foundations of their two perfect homes. The broken fence was repaired, its white slats pristine and whole again, a monument to the lie they were now living. To the outside world, the boundary was restored. But for Ethan and Sarah, it was a joke. They had their own private entrances, their own secret language, their own hidden world that pulsed with a life their public lives could never match. The lies came first. Initially, they were clumsy, tasting foreign and bitter in their mouths. Ethan would tell Clara he had a late site inspection, his heart hammering as he watched her face for any flicker of suspicion. Sarah would tell David she was joining a new evening pottery class, the details of her fictional hobby feeling fragile and easily shattered. But suspicion never came. Their spouses, comfortable in the predictable narratives of their marriages, accepted the excuses with an unnerving ease. And with each successful deception, the next lie became easier, smoother. The guilt, which had at first been a sharp, stabbing pain, dulled into a constant, low-grade ache, a background hum beneath the soaring thrill of their secret life. They became skilled actors, masters of the divided life, performing their roles as devoted spouses with a new, hollow proficiency. Their communication evolved into a coded dialect of desire. A text from Ethan saying, "The Henderson project is proving complicated," was a question, "Are you alone?" A reply from Sarah about the unpredictability of the weather was a confirmation, "The coast is clear." An emoji of a single leaf meant her studio. A coffee cup meant her kitchen. They built a lexicon of longing out of the mundane, their phones becoming portals to a world where they were truly known. They were not just lovers, they were co-conspirators, and the shared danger was a powerful aphrodisiac, binding them closer than any vow. Their time together was a tapestry woven from stolen moments. It wasn't always the feverish, all-consuming passion of their first encounters. Sometimes, it was just an hour in the late afternoon in her sun-drenched studio. He'd arrive ostensibly to borrow a tool or drop off mail delivered to the wrong house, and the door would close behind him, shutting out the world. They would talk. He would speak of the frustrations of his work, the creative compromises that felt like small deaths, things he could never tell Clara, who only understood success, not the struggle. She would talk about her art, the fear that her talent was atrophying, a fear she could never voice to David, who saw her painting as a quaint diversion. In that studio, surrounded by the scent of turpentine and the evidence of her passion, they were not a cheating husband and a faithless wife. They were simply Ethan and Sarah, two people who saw the parts of each other that the rest of the world overlooked. Then, inevitably, the talking would cease. A look would pass between them, and the air would shift, thickening with a familiar, potent energy. He would come up behind her as she stood before a canvas, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He would inhale her scent, a cocktail of paint and perfume that was, to him, the very essence of life. Their lovemaking took on the comfortable intimacy of a long-term relationship, a deep, knowing passion that was in some ways more profound than the frantic discovery of their first times. He learned the specific way she liked to be touched, the exact spot on her neck that made her shudder. She learned the language of his body, the subtle shift in his breathing that signaled his own release. It was a beautiful, tender, and utterly damning intimacy. The cruelest part was the return. He would leave her studio, his body still humming with the afterglow of their connection, and walk the 50 yards back to his own life. He'd step into the pristine kitchen where Clara was preparing dinner, the scent of roasting chicken replacing the scent of Sarah. The transition was a violent, spiritual whiplash. One evening, not an hour after leaving Sarah's arms, he sat at his perfectly set dining table. His son was recounting a story about school, and Clara was laughing, a polite, musical sound. She looked beautiful in the soft evening light, a perfect wife in a perfect home. And Ethan felt nothing but a vast, desolate emptiness. He looked at her, and his mind superimposed Sarah's face over hers. He could still feel the phantom sensation of Sarah's fingers on his skin, could still taste her on his lips. He picked up his wine glass, the expensive crystal cool against his fingers, and took a sip, the fine Cabernet tasting like ash. He was a ghost at his own family's table, a hollow man filled with a secret that was eating him alive from the inside out. The fear was a constant companion, a cold shadow that followed the warmth of their affair. A car driving past her house at the wrong time would send a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. A text from David arriving on her phone while she was in Ethan's arms would make them both freeze, their bodies rigid with panic. But the fear, they both came to realize, was part of the thrill. Each time they narrowly avoided discovery, each time a lie held fast, it was a small victory that reinforced the intoxicating illusion that their secret world was impenetrable. They grew bolder, their meetings more frequent, their excuses more elaborate. They were walking a tightrope hundreds of feet in the air, and the adrenaline, the focus, the sheer heart-stopping thrill of not falling had become as addictive as the passion itself. They were no longer just two lonely people who had made a mistake. They were architects of a complex, fragile, and beautiful deception, and they were in too deep to ever imagine finding their way back. The routine, once a source of comfort and thrilling predictability, had become a kind of careless lullaby, singing them into a state of dangerous complacency. The constant fear of discovery, which had once been a sharp, clarifying adrenaline, had softened into a dull background thrum. They had constructed their secret world so meticulously, had performed their public roles so flawlessly, that they had begun to believe in their own infallibility. They had a private language, a shared history, and a rhythm that felt as established as a marriage. And it was this comfort, this arrogance, that led them to make their first critical mistake. It was Ethan who suggested it. He was tired of the studio, of the constant awareness that it was Sarah's space. He wanted her in his world, a secret, triumphant possession in the heart of his own territory. "Come over to my house tomorrow," he'd said one afternoon, his lips against her ear. "Clara has her monthly luncheon with the Historical Society. She'll be gone for hours." Sarah had hesitated, a flicker of true fear in her eyes. The studio was their sanctuary, a neutral ground. His house. His house was Clara's. It was a line she had never imagined crossing. But he had persuaded her, his voice a low, seductive murmur about the thrill of it, the desire to have her in his bed, the ultimate consummation of their secret life. The risk, he assured her, was non-existent. And because she was as deep into the addiction as he was, she had agreed, the fear quickly consumed by a wave of illicit, heart-pounding excitement. The next day, she slipped through the gap in the fence and across his perfect lawn like a thief. Stepping into his house was a profound, disorienting experience. It was exactly as she'd imagined, beautiful, minimalist, and eerily silent. It was a home designed for display, not for living. She saw the framed photos on the mantelpiece: Ethan, Clara, and their two smiling children on a sailboat, a perfect family frozen in a perfect moment. It was a punch to the gut, a cold splash of reality that made her feel like a profane intruder. But then Ethan was there, closing the door behind her, his arms wrapping around her, his mouth finding hers, and the guilt was temporarily banished by the overwhelming force of their desire. He led her upstairs, into the master bedroom. The room was dominated by a massive, impeccably made bed. The air smelled faintly of Clara's expensive lavender and chamomile pillow spray. Making love there, on the high-thread count Egyptian cotton sheets that belonged to his wife, was the most transgressive, most terrifying, and most intensely passionate act of their affair. It was a violation and a reclamation, a planting of their flag on conquered territory. Afterward, they lay in the quiet afternoon light, filtering through the blinds, their bodies tangled, the room filled with the musky scent of their passion. They were drowsy, content, wrapped in the warm, deceptive blanket of their invincibility. It was in this peaceful, languid state that the sound came. It began as a low, familiar rumble from below, a vibration that seemed to travel up through the very bones of the house. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was still for a moment listening, a look of dawning horror on his face. Then the sound was confirmed by a soft whirring and a definitive thud. The garage door. Clara was home. Panic, cold, and absolute ripped through the room. The idyllic afterglow was incinerated in a nanosecond. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, scrambling from the bed, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. "She's hours early." They moved in a silent, frantic frenzy, a pantomime of pure terror. Clothes were a tangled mess on the floor. Ethan grabbed her silk blouse, shoving it into her hands. Sarah struggled to pull on her leggings, her fingers clumsy, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "The back door," Ethan hissed, his voice a raw whisper. He was pulling the duvet straight, punching the pillows, trying to erase the deep impressions their bodies had left in the bed. He grabbed the 2 wine glasses from the nightstand. One of them had a faint smudge of her lipstick on the rim and ran for the bathroom, rinsing them frantically, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped them. Sarah was dressed, her hair a wild mess, her face pale with fright. "My shoes," she mouthed, her eyes wide. They were by the bed. He grabbed them, shoved them into her hands, and propelled her toward the bedroom door. He could hear footsteps downstairs now, the jingle of keys being dropped into a ceramic bowl on the hall table. "Go," he whispered, pushing her toward the back staircase. "Through the kitchen, out the patio door. Don't run until you're past the hedge. Go now." She gave him one last, terrified look, and then she was gone, a silent phantom flitting through his perfect house. Ethan was left alone, his heart a roaring engine in his ears. He looked around the bedroom. Did it look normal? Did it smell normal? He couldn't tell. The scent of their lovemaking seemed to cling to everything, as potent and incriminating as blood. He heard Clara's voice call his name from the bottom of the stairs. He took a deep, shuddering breath, splashed cold water on his face from the ensuite bathroom, and forced his legs to move. He walked out onto the landing, arranging his face into a mask of mild, pleasant surprise. "You're home early," he said, his voice miraculously steady. Clara was standing in the foyer, shrugging off her coat. She looked up at him, and her eyes, which he had for so long seen as merely observant, now looked sharp, analytical, like a detective's. "The guest speaker canceled, so the luncheon fell apart," she said, her voice even. "I thought I'd come home and relax. Were you working?" "Just finishing up a call," he lied, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He came down the stairs, forcing himself not to look out the back window to see if Sarah had made it. Clara walked past him, heading toward the kitchen. As she passed, she paused, her head tilting slightly. She sniffed the air. "That's a nice smell," she said, her tone casual, almost conversational. "Is that a new aftershave?" Ethan's blood ran cold. It was Sarah's perfume, a light jasmine scent, now a screaming siren in the quiet house. "No," he said, forcing a laugh. "I think the cleaning service must have tried a new air freshener." The lie was pathetic. He knew it. She knew it. She didn't challenge him. She just gave him a long, unreadable look and continued into the kitchen. The conversation was over, but the interrogation had just begun. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in quiet tension. Clara was polite, distant, her eyes following his every move. The safe, predictable rhythm of their life was gone, replaced by a cold, watchful silence. The bubble had not just been shattered, it had been atomized. Later that night, as Clara was turning down the bed, she stopped. She reached down and picked something almost invisible from his pillow. She held it up to the light of the bedside lamp. It was a single, long strand of hair, not her own dark brown, but a shimmering, incriminating honey blonde. She looked at it, then looked at Ethan, her face a mask of cold composure. She didn't say a word. She simply dropped the hair into the wastebasket, turned off her light, and lay down with her back to him. The silence that filled the room was the sound of the end of the world. The single strand of honey blonde hair on his pillow was more devastating than any shouting match could ever have been. It was a quiet, damning piece of evidence that Clara never mentioned again. She didn't have to. Her silence was a new weapon in their marriage, a cold, sharp instrument she now wielded with precision. The space between them in their bed grew wider. Her politeness became a form of armor. Her smiles were thin, brittle things. She was watching him. He knew it. And that constant, quiet surveillance was the poison that finally killed the affair. The fear was no longer a thrilling, addictive spice. It was a bitter, suffocating poison. The exhilaration was gone, replaced by a constant, sickening anxiety. Every time his phone buzzed, his stomach would clench. Every unexpected knock on the door sent a jolt of panic through him. The change was immediate. Their secret world, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, its walls closing in. A planned meeting in the studio was canceled with a terse, unsigned text from him. "Too risky. Don't." There was no reply. None was needed. The frantic, passionate blaze of their affair was starved of its oxygen. The recklessness, the illusion of safety. It began to sputter. The coded messages dwindled, then stopped. The stolen glances across the fence were no longer filled with longing, but with a shared, hunted look. They were two soldiers trapped behind enemy lines, unable to communicate for fear of giving away their position. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing bleed-out. The silence returned, but it was a different kind. It wasn't the silence of anticipation that had preceded their first kiss. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a tomb. The affair died not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a series of unspoken, mutual retreats, a quiet, pathetic fizzle. The fire was over, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of regret and a profound, aching loss. Months passed. Summer's lush, green betrayal bled into the crisp, honest melancholy of autumn. The leaves on the old oak tree turned to brilliant shades of gold and crimson before finally letting go, blanketing the lawns in a carpet of decay. The houses in the neighborhood seemed to pull inward, windows closed against the growing chill. The gaping wound in the fence had long since been repaired, the new white slats a seamless scar. Life, on the surface, had returned to its placid, predictable rhythm. David was home, his booming laugh once again echoing from his back patio. Clara's social calendar was full. The children played. The cars came and went. The neighborhood was a perfect portrait of suburban peace. The end came at a Halloween block party. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wood smoke from a bonfire and the sweet, cloying scent of cheap candy. Families huddled together, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight and the ghoulish grins of carved pumpkins. Ethan was standing with Clara, a cup of warm cider in his hands, watching his son, dressed as an astronaut, compare candy with a tiny witch. He was performing his role, smiling, making small talk with other fathers, a perfect picture of contentment. He felt a presence, a shift in the air, and looked up. Across the crackling bonfire, through the dancing shadows and the swirl of smoke, he saw her. Sarah was standing with David, a faint, polite smile on her face as he draped a heavy arm around her shoulder. She was bundled in a thick sweater, her hair hidden under a wool hat. The vibrant, sun-kissed creature from the summer was gone, replaced by this pale, muted woman, her colors faded like the season. For a long, silent moment, their eyes met through the flames. The noise of the party, the laughter, the music, the excited shouts of children all fell away, and there was only the roar of the fire and the vast, silent space between them. It was a look that contained their entire, secret history. In her eyes, he saw it all again. The first curious glance over the fence, the jasmine-scented air of the barbecue, the feel of her hand under his in the rain, the taste of their first desperate kiss, the tangled sheets of his own bed, the absolute terror in her face as they scrambled for their clothes. He saw the passion, the guilt, the joy, the fear, but underneath it all now, there was something new, a deep, profound, and unending sadness. There was no anger, no blame. There was only the shared, devastating weight of what they had done and what they had lost. The desire was gone, burned away, leaving only the scar tissue of memory. It was he who broke the gaze first. He had to. To continue looking at her felt like an act of self-destruction. He turned back to his family, to the solid, real presence of his son, and took a sip of cider that did nothing to warm the sudden, absolute cold that had settled deep in his bones. He had survived. They both had. They had kept their secrets and saved their families, and in doing so, had sentenced a part of themselves to a quiet death. He glanced one last time toward the two houses, standing side by side in the autumn darkness. The fence between them was just a fence again, a simple structure of wood and nails. It was no longer a threshold, a barrier, or a crime scene. It was a tombstone, marking a grave that only two people in the world knew existed. And he knew, with a certainty, that would haunt him for the rest of his days, that the greatest tragedies are not the loud, explosive ones, but the quiet, invisible ones that play out behind perfect windows, in the deafening silence of a life you chose, while you forever dream of the one you let burn away on the other side of the fence.